All right. Well, everyone, nice to see you all. How are you doing? Having a good night?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So thanks, Wouter, so much for asking me to come and present something about GraphQL, which is one of our favorite subjects. If you look at my name with GraphQL, you probably see a lot of different meetup talks and conference talks I did on this subject just because I'm super passionate about it. So nice to share this with you tonight. So my name is Peerdeman. I'm also one of those old geezers that's still on Twitter. So if you want to follow me, you can look at Peerdeman and look at all of the pictures I'm taking of other people speaking at the meetups. I'm the technical director of Lively, which I'll talk more about in a second. In my spare time, I've got a new hobby which I call data hoarding. So I found out that if you have a time series database and you log a call to an API, for instance, it's an API for parking spots in Amsterdam. And if you log this over time, you get to see all these super nice graphs of when the parking spaces run out and this kind of things that really enthusiasms me. So, well, just collecting this data now and seeing what's going on. It's just a nice little hobby. Furthermore, I like to create some electronic dance music using synthesizers, which is also for anyone doing front-end development. You should definitely check this stuff out because it's super cool to do and super accessible nowadays. But unfortunately, or rather fortunately, my son was born 7 weeks ago, so I'm a fresh parent. So this means basically I don't have any time for that anymore. It's just the bottle, pooping, sleeping, and getting up again and giving a presentation on a Thursday night. So, so that's a little bit about me. Probably why you see that I'm a little bit sleepy. But hey, here to talk about GraphQL. All right, so a little bit about Lively. So unfortunately, to see, yeah, a little bit about Lively. We're a product development agency from Amsterdam. We're actually doing concept design development for multiple clients. We do this with a team of 25 in Amsterdam, where we use a lot of GraphQL. Yeah, and yeah, just a little bit to get a little bit of an impression there. And basically, well, the slide is now in Dutch, but we do validations and MVP, so finding out the concept of what should your product look like, or how can we revamp your product to fit a new market. Actually building an MVP and iterating on this MVP, or doing complicated migrations if you want to do some GraphQL, or want to switch your database, for instance. And then making sure that your team can actually do this thing themselves as well. So we also take developers onto our team to see how how you can do this stuff yourself, and then make sure that we're not needed anymore after a while. We do this with a team of conceptors, designers, developers, engineers, and managers, just to get a little bit of a context of the stuff that we're doing. But hey, tonight we're talking about creating, it's basically the context for the talk of tonight, creating full stack apps with our clients. Alright, so just to get a little bit of an idea of the kind of products that are using GraphQL, so I've picked only examples that are using GraphQL, but basically it's our go-to stack now. So these are all running in production using GraphQL. So this is TopTaal, which is a course planning software in which one of the biggest language institutes in Holland helps people who come to Holland and want to learn Dutch as a second language, put together courses for students and their teachers in a location, which they now use this system for. Department of Defense, doing the maintenance for the vehicles, which they used to do on these carbon papers. You probably know, I don't know if it's still, people actually still writing, but at Defense they were still writing with these carbon papers and creating an app for that, and creating the APIs in GraphQL, which is now being taken into production, which is a whole different story altogether. For another night. Then we have Ruler, which is compliance control. So as you can see, we're not that much focused in just one area. But this is for big financial companies to see if they're compliant to the law and be informed of all the changes. So super diverse, and this is Kandidaatvinden, which is like a live job chat, which also supports some super cool subscription stuff. So I'll definitely show this in the demo later on. All right, and we're doing some consultancy work as well now and then for different companies, amongst which Elanzas is also where we know Wouter from. All right, so a little bit of history on our technology stack, just to give you some background how we got into this stuff. In 2013, Lively was founded. In 2014, we started using Node.js. And then we found out about Meteor. And I'm just wondering, who has ever heard about Meteor? That's great, so everyone knows about it. So who has ever used Meteor? A couple of hands still. It was pretty cool stuff, right, at the beginning?
Cutting edge?
It was cutting edge. So maybe for those who were not went that big into Meteor itself, it was a way to do a full stack application in Node.js with just a couple of lines of code where you could do both the front end and back end in the same file and get something running up and running very quickly. So a lot of magic was happening behind the scenes. We were, I think, actually one of the few agencies that actually completely thought it was a super cool idea and even went into production with Meteor stuff. Well, in 2015, Meteor team started getting interested in this thing called GraphQL, which Facebook was experimenting with. So we thought, hey, that's cool. We just upgrade our Meteor stuff, and then started a new project in Meteor and GraphQL. Well, then Meteor, as some of you might have known, most of the team of Meteor went towards to work for Apollo, which is a GraphQL client. So we started using this as well. In 2016, we did blank Node.js with Apollo and GraphQL. And it's now 2020, and maybe a little bit of drum roll, please. What are we still using? It's still the same. So we basically stuck there, and we're really liking this so far. So we're probably sticking with this stack for now. All right, so we've got some React on the left side, we got Apollo and GraphQL on the right side, and when we do app development, we use React Native because it's the same logo, so you can imagine that it's like same paradigm. So anyone developing an app, look into React Native. That's just a little tip on the side, which is super nice stuff to also create mobile apps. All right, so back in the day, I don't know, like 10 years ago, everyone wanted to be as RESTful as possible because REST was like the next big thing, right? But REST has problems. REST has some problems. And probably, I don't know who has implemented a REST interface over here. We're on a front-end meetup, of course, but probably you've seen some REST interfaces. I think REST has some problems. Yes, guys, oh, I have some problems. As if I don't have any problems myself, but anyway. So one of these is nested data. Probably some of you have seen this pyramid of death here, which is commonly referred to as callback hell. So what you can see here is a user we find the user first, then we do another call because we want to find all the users, his friends, and then for each of the friends they want to find the post, and for each of the posts they want to find the comments, and in the end you're doing basically 6 nested calls. The page takes forever to load, and everyone is super happy with a super clean pyramid-like code shape. Well, not so great, not so great. And I mean, promises helps this a little bit, but it's still a little bit ugly. Then we have the mysterious query parameters. I don't know if anyone can read this, but it says get/API/dashboard. Yeah, course data is true. I want that one as well. Last enrolled is true because I want to add this one to the interface as well. Due payments filter. Well, a random undocumented parameter. Sure, whatever. We've all seen these calls, and they're pretty horrible. Then, of course, we have this one, which I also like. It's actually from a product that's still running. I won't say which one it is. v1/dashboard/default/load tasks. The mode is end day, and the page is page load is true, sure. So what do you think this call returns? It will probably be...
Tasks?
Yeah, it'd probably be nicely formatted JSON, right? You could also opt for XML SOAP response, something like that. Would also not surprise me. Well, actually, it gives you back this like a big block of divs that will just render in an iframe and make everyone's world a worse place. So that was basically okay. Excuse me. And then we have, of course, the entityless methods with side effects. This was one that I've always found really painful when you create a super clean REST API, and then of course you have to /API/v1/ some random RPC call to change something on the backend. Please don't sue me for not adhering to the REST spec in this call, because the REST spec is basically made to serve entities and to change entities. And then we have the versioning and the legacy support. So I don't know if anyone is maintaining an API with multiple versions. Has anyone done this? Any hands there? Yeah? Okay. So the first one is all fun and games /API/v1/user. Then we have the v1 user, sure, I'll keep these working still. And then API/v user, please don't make me remap all these legacy fields again. And then v4, oh sure, yeah, I'll do it again. We'll migrate again, and then we'll upgrade the version, and we'll keep all these other versions working because certain clients just want to keep using the v1 API. And then the documentation. I mean, Swagger was okay. This was the last one, and I think it's now commonly accepted. Everyone at least has an idea, like maybe I should supply some documentation with my API. So, introducing GraphQL. When people ask me what it is, I always describe it as a query language for APIs. And just a little bit of a round of hands, who knows about GraphQL? So everyone knows about GraphQL. Who has actually been using GraphQL? That's also good, nice. And then maybe a little bit of spoiler, who has ever seen a GraphQL subscription? Oh, not that. Oh, okay. Well, a little bit of spoilers then, but hey, it was called Apollo and subscriptions, right? So you knew what you were in for. All right. So a nice thing to note. I gave this presentation a while ago, and I had all these pictures I created myself about explaining how GraphQL works. And I thought, you know what? Just before I'm going to present these slides, I'm just going to go to the GraphQL website to see what the current way was that they were explaining it. And these animations are so freaking genius. I'm not even going to try to do my own stuff and just show you these animations because they make it so clear here. I won't get into so much detail because everyone knows very well what it does, but just marvel at this way of presenting it. So, asking what you need and get exactly that. So the idea is you don't have to add a query parameter to say I want to add some more data. No, I just say I want the name and I want the height, and then the mass, and you get exactly that returned from your API. Then you get the other one, which is also nice, is getting more than one entity in one request. So if you had a REST API, you would call /API/user and /API/blogs, for instance, and you need to do both calls. Well, with GraphQL, you can just say, I want, nice timing, I want a hero, a name, and his friends. And it will just return this data all at once. And we'll just leave all this hard work for the people on the back end to do their stuff and make sure that it will still retrieve all these results. As a front ender, this is super chill. Then we have describing what's possible with the type system. So this means that because the thing is, the whole API is strongly typed, you can see exactly the fields that you can query, and you can actually see the types that will be returned as well. So when you call a GraphQL endpoint, you know for sure that it will never return a bunch of divs or an XML response. It will always be exactly what you were expecting because it's strongly typed. And then my mind was blown because there's even an animation showing off the versioning perfectly well. So brace yourselves for this cool thing that I'm just going to take credit for on this meetup. You can see when the animation starts again, you start with the film, and then we add a director, then we add the directed by, And then we say, well, this director is now deprecated, so we add this, and it's added to the documentation, so people can see that this field will be deprecated later. But you can immediately use this new field, and you will just add fields to a model instead of having /API/v1 and then having to remap all the fields to the v2 API. So I thought it was pretty cool. It's a nice animation, right? Just keep this in the slides from now on. All right, so good standards need good tools. When we were back in the day with Meteor, there was this spec for the WebSocket, which was called DDP, the Dynamic Data Protocol, and it specified the way that you could talk about through WebSockets, but it did not supply any tool to debug this communication with. So it just went into Chrome and got into the WebSocket and just was debugging it there. I think that's the reason why it didn't really take off. I thought it was a really cool thing. I gave a conference talk about DDP because everyone just thinks of their own WebSocket API, but it's of course better to use a good standard. Well, with GraphQL they used GraphQL as the tool that you can use to explore the API, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so successful. All right, so just don't know why these are not auto-loading, but just to get a little bit of an idea, you have this interface where you can query your API and get auto completion for both the parameters of fields, the fields that you can actually select, and you can see the results and use this to create your query and just copy pasting this query inside your front end or your web application or your app or whatever you are going to query it for. Use it to query. All right, so just for a second, the thing that amazed me most is that any front end can write its own query for exactly the data that they need from the API. So just let us sink in for a second. I think this is one of the most powerful parts, especially if you're working on an API that has multiple teams consuming the same API, is that every front end, so both the person creating a web application that shows, a desktop screen shows everything, as the person creating a mobile application, or even me in the few hours I still have left between giving a bottle on the Pebble watch or the what's called the Fitbit watch to just give back one piece of data from the API. I thought it was pretty cool. So it's basically like I got this power now to define, putting all this power into the hands of the front end people. I was thinking about this cool movie it's a while ago, Bruce Almighty, right? All right, so just to see some code, like how we're going to use GraphQL. And I saw everyone raise their hand, so just go through this really quick. Vanilla JavaScript, so just everyone can use this, not even React here. So we define a string, this is a query, defined as a string. So we basically copy-pasted this thing from the GraphQL interface, we put it in a variable, and then we just call a fetch on this endpoint. So the endpoint is always an endpoint that you post data to. You give it some headers, and then you pass the body, which contains the variables. And then you return some JSON and you log it. So that's basically the shortest way of just doing a request to the server, getting some data back, and defining what data you want inside the string. Well, of course, everyone here is using React, so we're really curious to see how can we do this in a little bit of a nicer way. You can actually do this declaratively using Apollo and React. So Apollo is the client library to do this. All right, so we have a way of defining these queries in a little bit a nicer form, which is also a great plus because your code editor will detect that you're writing a GraphQL statement, which means that if you connect it actually to your GraphQL endpoint, it will also do auto-completion inside your code editor, which was quite magic when I saw it the first time. So we define this query in a similar way as we did before. Then we have a component that we're creating here, And inside this component, we use the query component, which we pass the query that we just created. And then inside this query component, we put the rest of our React components. So you can see here, what's really nice about this declarative way is that you define this query, and because you're inside this query component, you automatically get some things extra. So for instance, you get a loading indicator, which means that while this request is still running, loading will be true, and you can, for instance, show a spinner. Loading, yeah, so if loading, return loading component. It also gives the error. If there was an error, you can immediately show this error. But you can, of course, also return your component that you're actually going to re-rendering some data to. And of course, this course material list containing this data is perfectly deconstructed and hosted in a nice storybooks way, being deconstructed and all these things. So now I'm actually lying there, but we'll take this tip and see if we can deconstruct our components even better. Well, that's the top level. So basically, the container passing the data to this to our accordion. Yeah, so that's the declarative data fetching. Already feels a little bit like cleaner than just doing this fetch myself. All right, so that's great. Now, Peter, come on, show me something fancier. So we're going to see if there's some more nice features that Apollo, this GraphQL client in React, is going to do for us. So if we look at a little bit of the advanced features that Apollo gives, one of these is Fetch More, which is a super clean pagination API. So you can use this function to very cleanly browse through different pages of your data, instead of just having this page parameter and then putting a number in there and then raising the number and doing this manually yourself. Which I thought was really cool was prefetching. So imagine having a list of imagine an accordion, because we were looking at this, and each part of the accordion would load a subsequent part of the data. You could, while hovering over the accordion, you could already prefetch this data before someone is actually clicking, and when someone clicks, you can immediately see this data because you already did this request. So probably your mobile phone bandwidth won't really like that, because it will get all this data in advance, but if you want to have a super smooth experience, then you can do these kind of tricks with Apollo.
It doesn't detect your finger hovering, so you'll be fine.
Yeah, oh, that's of course, yeah. So maybe during scrolling. Then we have the in-memory normalized cache, which is the sort of the default setting for Apollo in caching on the client. So if you would do the same query immediately after, or you would do the same query for the same data on the same screen multiple times, it will actually you just call the API one single time and use this result for all the other components as well, which is pretty cool. And it can also be a pain in the butt, of course, if you're trying to refresh some stuff, but you figure it out when you're using it. Then we have the optimistic response. It's also something that Meteor was really keen on, where they said, for instance, if you would have a list of stuff and you would star something, then you would have to do a call to the backend and wait for it to actually see if the result came back okay. You would need to show a spinner. But what you could do is just have an optimistic response. So think, when I press this star, I will assume that it will just be okay, and only if there's an error, I will show an error or something. Have this idea that the UI will respond immediately, which you can do with optimistic response. And then, of course, we have my favorite of all, which is the subscriptions, which will allow you to push data from the server to a client, or to the clients. All right, let's see. So if we think back about subscriptions and the kind of applications that we can do with this, just wanted to give a little bit of a background. Like, it's an API standard for WebSocket style communication, and I know I'm totally butchering this idea here, but just to get a little bit into this vibe of WebSocket communication. It's always demoed this way, and I didn't want to put the two browser tabs in there for the live demo. So you see two screens, and when the first one is putting some stuff in there to do a chat, it will show up on the right side and vice versa. So there's a WebSocket communication between these two tabs, and the data is being pushed from the browser to the server, and from the server back to the other clients. So if we're doing subscriptions in GraphQL, this is a little bit what it would look like. So this would be the definition, the GraphQL query that you would create. You would have a subscription, and for instance, it would be on comment edit. So this would be a blog system where comments would be, you would be able to put comments in there, and when a new comment is added, this function will actually, this data will actually be returned. You would see that the ID and the content of this comment would be returned, and you would pass some information. The data that would be returned through this WebSocket will then look like this. So we have a comment added, the ID is this, and the content is that, because we defined it over here. Now, if we look at React, when I gave this presentation a while ago, this API was pretty cumbersome. The application I'm going to show was also from that time, but they really did a great job in revamping this API to make it look a lot cleaner. So it's actually quite a few lines of code. We have again a constant in which we put the query that we just saw, the on comment edit, and inside your React code you would have a function in which you would define a constant saying we have comment edit, and basically all the magic happens inside the use subscription helper. So of course this is not really all the code. You need to do some setting up to make sure that you define the WebSocket, and you make sure that the application knows about the WebSocket and that it gets linked. But I mean, this is basically just a piece of boilerplate that you would put into your application. But actually, the part where you're using the subscription would be just use subscription, giving it the subscription definition, then adding the variables again to make sure that you know about what repo you want to get the subscription, and then you would have the call that actually would render a component which would show the content from the added comment, which I thought was pretty cool because it's super short and it will actually be a reactive interface. All right, so Peter, get on with the demo already. I'll see if I can get it working and if my authorization tokens still are valid and stuff, but I just want to get into this application a little bit. Let's see what's happening over here. So, excuse the mess, it's a bit of the development environment, so it's a little bit of the look behind the screen. But just to get a little bit of an idea of this application, we have a site over here, which would be a mock site. Yeah, for now it's a mock site where, for instance, it's a page about verpleeghulp or an electrotechnician, and based on the page where this widget is loaded on, you would actually have a part of the screen that will allow you to chat with someone inside this branch to, for instance, get in touch with a company that might have some jobs before actually sending in your resume to apply officially. But we're debugging over here, so we have a chat box. It's quite like the intercom widget. I don't know if you know about this intercom, or what's this other thing called? Yeah, precies. So if you would send this message, then at the back end of this system there would be a moderator who has this interface of all these different chats going on the left side, and then this person would actually chat with the person that's visiting the website. Hello, enter, and if everything still works, hey, we have the chat popping up over here. Good evening. And then over here, this operator is able to, for instance, send a privacy message or propose some companies. But what's really interesting, of course, is what is happening under the hood here. So I've opened the Chrome DevTools. Is this readable for everyone? Can I maybe increase it a little bit? get a little bit crowded over here. But hey, we see some different calls being made on the left side. Just going through this, an idea what this looks like. So here we have, it's the plain text password. It's great. We have some calls being made. So for instance, we have a query where we would actually see my first name, moderator, and which agency I'm currently in, which is being used for this tag in the top right. But what's more important, of course, is the WebSocket that's being created here. So if we go over there, we can see this WebSocket, and then you really see the raw WebSocket interaction over here. So you can see that there's an initialization being made, and you can see that there's 2 updated chat. I have to see where this message is. This was the one I was searching for. Payload is updated chat. Yeah, okay, so the idea is that when this WebSocket is being started up, we're actually subscribing to a certain message that we are waiting for. And the subscription that we're waiting for is updated chat. So we subscribe for an updated chat, which means that every time the server receives a chat from a candidate, it will push this data to the moderator and give a new message which is called updated chat. And as you can see over here, after this first initial subscription, so the green ones are the ones that are being sent to the server, you can see that there's white messages coming back, white colored messages, which contain these tests that I was sending earlier. So it's basically it has a type field, an ID, and a payload with the data, which is exactly the data that was requested by the subscription. Which I thought was really cool, because usually, I don't know who has implemented a WebSocket API, maybe some hands for that. So what did you use as a sort of API spec? Was there some standard that you adhere to, or was it just something you thought of?
I was talking to my own server, so just like roll your own, whatever.
Yeah. Because, and maybe someone else who did something similar?
Jason.
Yeah. So at least it was Jason. That's good. Yeah. Comma separated values. Yeah. But that's like super common, because well, if you see all the WebSocket tutorials, it's just send a bit of JSON, get a little bit of JSON back. But from my point of view, it would be really cool if all the WebSocket APIs would actually use a subscription, a GraphQL subscription interface, because then it would be really easy to connect to different APIs, or maybe programmatically connect to different APIs and exploit it this way. All right, so that was a little bit of the demo over here, just to get a little bit of insight. I won't bother you with the code of this application, because we're using an earlier interface of the Apollo stuff, which is a little bit bigger. All right, let's see where we were. All right. All right, so then we go to the backender's favorite part of this presentation. So instead of an FAQ, I do an FPP, which is the frequently posted problems for people struggling with the idea of going to use GraphQL, because there's probably if you've ever written some backend, you can already imagine that you're going to run into some problems. So one of the first one is we don't use JavaScript on our backend, because, well, not everyone uses Node.js. I mean, we're big fans of this, but not everyone uses this. But of course, there's GraphQL packages. It's a language specification. So there's packages for Node.js, C#, Java, Python, PHP. Will probably even for your watch. We've also done a project in Python once, where we used the GraphQL API over there. Of course, Node.js makes it really easy to do a lot of asynchronous stuff and resolve things asynchronously. But there's very good packages for all the others as well. Then the next one, you don't get any decent caching, do you? Because, I mean, REST adheres to this HTTP spec, and HTTP lends itself to caching really well with the caching headers. So yes, this is true. You lose the HTTP caching because every request you make to the server is a post request and cannot be cached. But you can still cache data inside the API layer, and I've seen some very smart. Is everything going well over there?
It happened also the last time. I'm not sure what it is. But
I'll just talk through it.
We'll
get used to it in the end. Yeah. So you can still cache this data inside the API layer, and I've even seen some very smart tricks being done that if you detect that it's an unpersonalized call, so it's not a logged in call, but you do a GraphQL query that is exactly like the previous one. Of course, you can still cache this on the layer of your web server. And then this is maybe the biggest one. Querying fields from frontend doesn't really sound secure. We used to do this back in the day with sending MySQL queries to the backend. Oh, we got an extra one. Nice. Sending MySQL queries to the backend, which was also a big no-no and not a good idea. To basically combat this security, every field has a resolve method and can be guarded as you would guard any REST endpoint itself as well. The fact that it's a field inside GraphQL or it's a REST endpoint to a certain entity doesn't really matter much. You still have to guard it yourself. The part where it gets really tricky is when you start nesting data, because sometimes you want to restrict this nested data, but have a different call where I need to explain this better. Have a different call where you're using this this subset in it. No, I'm totally bombing this explanation. But for instance, if you would query the user data itself, you might guard it and say, I don't want to share the password. But if you're, for instance, loading a blog and you say, I want to show the blog and I want to show the user, then you need to be damn sure that you don't let someone querying the blog actually retrieve the password from this sub data. It is tricky, and it's something that I was discussing it today with part of the team as well. It is tricky to do this really well, but it is possible. So you just have to pay really a good care that you cannot get to certain data through traversing this GraphQL tree. And there was another one, but I don't think it's actually in my list. You mentioned it, you mentioned it in the break. Performance.
Yeah.
Yes, which is also a nice one. So if you would have all these resolvers on the back end and you would say, retrieve my profile and then my friends and then the friends of my friends and then the friends of their friends. You can imagine that this database is going to blow up sometime. So there's different things that you can do over there. One thing is, it's really annoying, huh? From the top. So imagine that you're doing this request where you have your profile and you have your friends of your friends. You can already see what kind of subdata you are traversing from the top level. So what you can do is already join this information in. So create one database query that will actually have the data for all the subsequent calls as well, and then use. And now the building is exploding, basically. Okay. So where was I? I was with the joining of the queries. So I'm basically butchering the talk that Brian gave a couple of meetups earlier. So I'll leave a comment in the meetup description showing. Oh, that's so much better. Thank you for that. I share his presentation where he shows how you can optimize this. And then, of course, for the performance, I have one other one, is whitelisting only the queries that you think your frontend should make. So instead of allowing anyone to make any GraphQL call, you can say, I want to just allow people to make just the friends of my friends. And if you go one level deeper, I will just say, no, I don't accept this query, which is also a nice way of sort of containing the depth in which your users are going to hammer your server. All right, so at Lively we love GraphQL for just wrapping up a little bit uniformity, which is very nice that all of the APIs that we're building is built in a similar way, and that the people working with these applications get results that they expect. It's linked data hydration done right, which I hadn't really seen before in any REST API. So hydrated nested data. It's like when you get the user and the blocks inside there, and do this in a nice way. Strong typing is expectation management. So if you're a backend developer and you're creating an API, you strongly type it, then someone consuming your API will know exactly what data they are going to receive. So it's a bit of expectation management done through the technology. Then we have the auto-documented API, which is great because no one really likes typing Swagger documentation and keeping it up to date. So basically when you publish a GraphQL API, the documentation is updated for you. You have the versioning flexibility that we talked about before. And with one that's also really relevant if you're doing a lot of full stack APIs is consolidating microservices and legacies into one API. Very nice talk has been done about this from Ogor, who worked for KLM, who had different big APIs like the booking one and the profile one and the flight information, which was all separate APIs, and they created this GraphQL integration layer that basically stitched all of these different APIs together, so that the product teams could actually use all of the data from all these different silos as if they were talking to one API, which was pretty cool. And we're also using this to, for instance, retrieve some information from a third party. So we have an integration somewhere with TwinField, and then we have a field inside our GraphQL API that just says TwinField ID, and it would actually do a call to this third-party API. But a front-end would never see this and just get the field result. But most of all, we have the front-end backend love, so the integration between the front-end and the backend team, which is something that we're really keen on in our teams. So API clarity, if it's there, it works like this, and if it's not there, then it's not implemented yet. So you have no discrepancies over that. It's documentation, and you can also use it as a handover. One thing I really like is that the front end will tend to get involved earlier and think ahead in discussing APIs and contracts. We found it a really nice way to define a stub, for instance, that you're going to need later on. Like, it would be great if I would have a field that has X and Y information. It will actually be almost like a briefing for the backend team. Like, I can implement it in a certain way, which was really nice. So if you want to get started with this stuff, there's a really good tutorial by Prisma, howtographql.com, which is really good. And then if you're willing to see this tight integration with React as well, Wes Bos, I don't know if you know him, he's a super good tutorial guy, has created advanced React.com, which is it's not a free course, but it's a super deep dive into using React components and doing this GraphQL stuff. So definitely check those out. So if you want to do a project with us, please get in touch. There's pictures of Dirk and Brian here as well, so pull them on their jacket if you want to know more about this. And thanks so much for your attention. All right, so any more frequently posed problems maybe? Or FAQs? Anyone have some ideas about subscription APIs?
There's one thing, the backend, how difficult is it to implement? Because it looks super easy in the front end, but is it super hard in backend, or?
So, the GraphQL is basically you should see it as an empty shell, because it's really what GraphQL is on the backend is a translation from a front end gives you this query. It does some parsing of this query to check if it's correct, and then it will translate this into a function call, which is just your API has been called, you're being queried for 3 parts of information on this field, and you can resolve this in any way you like. So you can return stub JSON, for instance, just type return and then type these fields, or you can do a database call, or you can do a call to a legacy API, as long as you return the data in the way that the front end is shown. So is it difficult at the back end? If you would compare it to implementing a REST call, just the single REST call, implementing an API like the single REST call is not harder in GraphQL. I think the hard part comes where you're nesting this data and trying to do the security and authorization really right. But this can be tricky inside a REST endpoint as well.
What if you use like an object relational member, like
yeah.
can you like tell to do that, and this like some standard for this, or like?
Well, it's not really standard, but for instance, if you would get a query, I want to get all the blocks, then inside your resolver method that's being called, this empty function, you can say blocks.findAll and then return all of the blocks from your object relational member, and then you might even use this object relation mapper to hydrate some data in nested fields. Yeah, you can do it any way you like.
Yeah, you can even use the same types. We are now in process of implementing GraphQL on our backend. We use SQLize as an ORM, and we use exactly the same types that govern the GraphQL typings, and the same types are used for the ORM themselves. So that's pretty painless.
The Node.js backend?
Node.js, yeah.
Okay.
You still have the hard parts, are still the authentication and getting that all right, but this part is actually pretty easy.
What are you using on the backend?
I'm trying to get rid of backends.
Firebase.
And I want to be front end.
Kind of guy.
Yeah.
It's hard if you have the skills.
Yeah.
There's also a direct integration with Postgres, so you can directly get
Yeah.
like a GraphQL interface of Postgres.
Okay.
Yeah. So, any other questions?
Not really a question, because I think it's an entire talk. Schema architecture best practices.
The schema architecture best practices.
Yeah, and then sub-questions, query and parameter management, like what makes a good query, and what should be parameterized and what should not. What should be a custom resolver, and what can you just like go directly tie into your database, for example. And then one question I think you can answer right now.
Without giving a next talk
Yeah,
for next
exactly,
hour.
because these are large. So I'm giving them less feedback, like this
Yeah.
is what you could talk about next time. The question that I am interested in, like server scaling when doing subscriptions,
Yeah.
because the WebSockets are intense.
Yeah, it is.
And especially if like you want all of your clients connecting to every other client,
Yeah. It's
and
no.
you've got 5 billion clients,
Yeah. It's
you
not going
cannot
to be
run
fun.
on one WebSocket
No.
server. So
It's
what
going
do
to
you
be
do?
it's going to be painful. Yeah. So this is it's a really nice question. There's a lot of stuff in there. We'll have to write some stuff down for the the schema one. I could
Yeah.
talk for days for all the different ways you can do the schema
Yeah, I would
stitching.
like to hear.
There's super cool stuff now being created by the GraphQL team to have microservices and stitch these together. We've also given some advice to actually not do this and just keep it inside one schema, because you don't have to redo all these types all over again. And well, there's a whole talk there. To get back to the question, just help me spark the last question.
Server scaling. With
Yeah, the server scaling. Yeah. So I'm talking about back in the day all the time. I don't know. I'm getting old. When we were doing Meteor in production, this was painful because all the data was being done through the WebSocket. So there was no REST endpoint. Everything was done through the WebSocket. So when we were doing this, there was one thing we found out, which was our friend, which is called Sticky Sessions. It's called. It's a plugin for, was it Nginx or? It was Nginx, right? It was a plugin for Nginx that would remember to which. It was inside the load balancer, so we had a load balancer, then we had multiple application servers, which all had this WebSocket API running. Then we had a load balancer with sticky sessions, so each session request that would come in, it would remember which application server it was connected to earlier. It would open up the WebSocket, and then each packet that would come in would be redirected to the same node. So then at least you knew for sure that when you have multiple things coming in, that they were being divided over these application servers. And then it would basically just scale horizontally, and it ramped up pretty quickly. It was pretty mad with the amount of servers that you needed to handle all these WebSockets at the same time, especially when you were retrieving all of your data through this WebSocket. So that was not really a lot of fun. I think nowadays, and you could also see it inside the Kandidaatvinder application, most of the data is retrieved through just simple request response, and just a super small notification is made, for instance, for an updated chat. So the only thing that it would retrieve, or that I would suggest anyone who's going to create a big scaling thing would do, is just say there is something new. Just let you know that there's something new, and then request the data through the request response, for instance. So keeping this subscription stuff super small, which helps a little bit, but in the end, yeah, you're totally right. Expanding this, scaling this horizontally, like if you really have a heavy product, this can be quite painful. But I think now with these load balancing being done in Kubernetes, and having a little bit more tools of having these flexible architectures, you can resolve. It's possible to resolve this. Just I hope a little bit of background. Any other questions?
I can make a comment to this actually.
Okay.
A trick that you can actually do is that mostly having too many clients is the problem, and to have too many messages. So what you can do is basically like have a lot of simple WebSocket services that then themselves open a WebSocket connection to another app server behind. So you can basically like have like a triangular kind of setup. And this actually works that you can have this easier to scale. So you have like very simple services that just pass on these messages, but are themselves just like work also as
Waarschijnlijk gaat over 3 kwartier het langer al.
Okay.
Dan moet je even met je tech tegen dat kastje daar aan. Twee keer.
Ik loop er even mee.
All right.
Mijn plaats.
Thanks for the addition. So maybe for the people watching at the video, talking about creating a WebSocket layer beneath the WebSocket layer to make sure that you can handle more connections, right? Yeah. Maybe any other questions? Yeah.
I do have actually a question myself. So the integration with React itself is very nice, but what I struggle with is integrating GraphQL with Redux. So to like make the state persist this in the front end. Do you have a nice solution for this?
Yes, it's a bit of a gewetensvraag. What's a gewetensvraag in English?
Conscience.
Yeah, a question of conscience. So actually, we got a little bit into Redux, and we were trying to fit it in with the rest, but we were already using Apollo, and Apollo does a couple of things that Redux does as well. Even for a while, it used. Now I don't know exactly if it was Redux or the other one, the competitor, but it was using this kind of state management under the hood. In the end, we did not switch to Redux, so we just use Apollo itself to manage the state, because it also did some of the caching in there. Integrating it in then you have to. And Brian is shaking his head. It was so much. It was so much boilerplate. I just didn't really like Redux myself because you had to do all these like 10 files for just adding one small part. And we've got some applications that's really like 400, 500 pages big and still doing very well without this kind of state management. If I would implement it, you would just do the GraphQL queries at the point where you're requesting your data and feeding it into the REST. But you don't really get these nice benefits that Apollo gives you. Yeah. So this was our experience. So sorry not be able to give you a more detailed answer than that.
Well, I guess we made the same experience.
Yeah. Any more questions? Anyone want to get into some beers and some talks, at least before the alarm goes off, right?
Yeah, I think we have 3/4 of an hour, she said. But anyway, we'll see.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
So you're welcome to stay to have another beer, and you can also leave whatever.